So this Saturday we have yet another undisputed title fight. This one taking place in the lightweight division between George Kambosos Jr. and Devin Haney. Kambosos Jr. enters this fight as the unified WBA, IBF and WBO champion, whereas Devin Haney enters it as the WBC champion. Very interesting fight in my opinion. Of course, it's interesting because all the marbles are on the line. It's high stakes. We're going to have an undisputed champion. But also stylistically, I feel that both guys have the strengths to exploit the other's weaknesses, and that can lead to some good back and forth competitive action. So to provide some context of my impressions of both fighters, I feel like I've been guilty of selling them both short in the past. And starting with Kambosos, I always felt that he was a little bit rigid, a little bit tight, didn't really have the mobility that I'd like to see in a fighter. But he made up for it by having a lot of natural athleticism, a lot of speed, explosiveness, and I think just sharpness in general. And I feel like that's one of his best assets, and probably one of his most underrated assets as well, is his ability to counterpunch. Kambosos is very sharp on the counter, and I feel that he displayed this best in his fight against Lee Selby. And I use this Selby fight as an example because, yeah, like there are differences, but I feel Selby resembles Haney quite a bit. And now they have their own strengths and weaknesses, both Selby and Haney. But for the most part, they are, I want to say, consistent long-range boxers. Despite all of Selby's shortcomings, he's not a very popular fighter in the UK. He certainly isn't the Welsh Mayweather like he tried to make out he was for a few years. But he's a big guy at the weight. He moves well. He's quite smooth in the way he boxes, and he's quite competent at long range. And Selby, being the long range boxer he was, looked to establish the jab. Of course, mixing it in with his movement, but that was his kind of go-to weapon. And him being considerably bigger than Kambosos, he was often being countered quite effectively by Kambosos. Despite the fact that Kambosos, you don't really associate him with long-range boxing. But he has a good ability to pull counter jabs. But he seems to prefer pull countering to his right and then coming back in with a right hand. But he can counter in combination as well. And I feel like this is going to serve him well against Devin Haney, who... Haney is much more athletic than Lee Selby, I feel. Probably doesn't move as well and isn't as quick, but that's because he's a naturally bigger guy. But I think with that natural size comes more strength. But with Haney, even though he moves his feet pretty well, his head is often very stationary. And against the counterpuncher like Kambosos, who's going to look to counter your jab and slip off and then pull back in with looping shots in particular, I feel like that can go, it can spell trouble for Devin Haney. And the positioning of Devin Haney's head, where he's often stuck on the center line when he's punching, it also explains why his power isn't the greatest, because that's one of the main criticisms of Devin Haney, is his lack of knockouts and lack of power. And it's really not necessarily self-explanatory, but you can see it because with his punching technique, he doesn't shift his weight effectively. He doesn't transfer his weight from right to left or left to right as effectively as he could. And as a result, he has less power, and his head doesn't move as much because he's not moving from one side of his stance to the other, which is how you generate power in your punches. I've explained this many times in the past. Even done a Julian Jackson and Nonito Donaire film study. Check them out. And explains it all. But Devin Haney, for whatever reason, it's not refined. He hasn't been truly schooled in his punching mechanics, but it costs him from a defensive point of view as well. And George Kambosos, on the flip side, he does it very well in these punches, especially his counters. If you look at the way he's able to really dig in with his right hand and take himself off the center line, same thing with the left hook. Whereas Haney, he can't afford to get caught on the center line, but he looks like he has that habit of getting caught on the center line. However, Haney does have some upside, because even though George Kambosos Jr. is a very accomplished counterpuncher, very sharp counterpuncher. After he's had his success and he's landed his punches, a lot of the time he's just magnetic to the center line. So he can get himself off with his punches, but there's very little defensive responsibility afterwards. And sometimes he will just return there. And a good opponent will spot that. And I feel like Haney has flaws, yes, but he does have good eyes. He has flashes where he does remind me of Floyd Mayweather, kind of Andre Ward. And he has something that I refer to as in-between timing. And what that is if you have the start of an engagement where both fighters are in range and they're able to throw and land shots potentially, and then they have the end of the engagement where they typically come out, maybe at an angle, they get some more distance and they can't just reach over and land their shots. That would be the end of the engagement. But what Haney does is he does a good job of kind of still remaining in an engagement, but without the opponent knowing. And then what Haney will do is he'll sneak in a shot, usually a jab. And you see this sometime in his sparring in particular when he's kind of going through the motions. But I feel like he did show it quite well in the Linares fight, where Linares, who has, he's not entirely the same as Kambosos, but he has a similar style. He has like a preference for combinations and he can throw them quite explosively. But then he tends to not have much defensive responsibility afterwards. Well, Devin Haney was able to really exploit that on a couple of occasions with just usually a single shot, but it was a very clean and very telling single shot. Usually a jab to the body or a jab to the head, and sometimes he can actually follow up with that. And now when I describe this, you can start to envisage how this fight can be quite competitive, because you'll have Devin Haney at long range looking to establish his jab, obviously being the bigger guy and the guy with a preference for fighting at long range. But then you have the sharp counterpuncher of Kambosos, who, as that Haney jab comes in, Kambosos is going to look to come off, pull counter, come back in with his shot, and potentially have success landing because Haney doesn't always take his head off the center line when he's punching. And then Kambosos has successfully pull countered, but then he returns to the center line, and then assuming that Devin Haney isn't in such bad shape after being countered, if he does, he can then capitalize on Kambosos' lack of defensive responsibility. And I know that sounds confusing as hell because I'm trying to break it down stage by stage, but I hope that's clear. But that's what I see in my head. I see it being a very close fight, as I say, where Kambosos looks to counter Devin Haney at long range, maybe does so successfully, but then he's not defensively responsible enough, and then takes return fire from Devin Haney. But even though I can see how this fight is close, I think we do have to factor in the kind of extraneous variables. Of course, this fight is taking place in Australia, which is Kambosos' home country, and he's kind of received the label of being a diva in the build up to this fight, which, look, I'm not privy to everything that goes on behind the scenes, but Kambosos, he went to Teofimo Lopez's backyard in New York and fought him as a 10-1 underdog, I believe, and won the belts. So why isn't he entitled to his fight in his home country? Because Devin Haney hasn't really had that defining fight yet. He's had a lot of wins over, a handful of good competition consecutively, has to be said. But, Kambosos has that career-defining win. Yeah, it's just one, but it's a pretty significant win, and it was in the other guy's backyard. So now, Devin Haney has to go to Kambosos' backyard. I don't have a problem with that. And credit to Devin Haney, because, of course, it's no surprise he's having to travel without his dad, who I believe is co-trainer, and Ben Davison, who's also another co-trainer. So maximum credit to both guys, but especially Devin Haney, because he's really got it stacked up against him. And so I do believe that this is going to be a very close and competitive fight. I can see how both guys have success, as I've described. And but you know what? I feel like the maturity, and just the general. I feel like Kambosos definitely has the advantage here. Of course, it's in his hometown. He's going to get favourable treatment, but I feel like he's maybe just a bit tougher and a bit more experienced. Whereas Devin Haney, he has some potential, but when I look at Haney, there's just a bit of greenness, Technically, maybe tactically, I think he's just going to be a little bit too vulnerable in spots and will probably just have too many rounds taken from him. I do feel like, even I've just said that Haney's green, excuse me, I feel like he is wily enough to go the distance. But of course, if it goes to points, I don't think the judge is going to do him any favours, even if he does manage to stamp his authority on the fight. So I'm going to go for George Kambosos winning a decision. I want to say a very close unanimous decision, like maybe Kambosos winning a UD by like 1 or 2 rounds, potentially. If it's a much more competitive fight and one that a lot of people in the kind of boxing public feel that Haney wins, I feel like Kambosos scrapes by with a split decision. So I don't think Haney can stop Kambosos, and I don't think he's going to get a decision, even if the boxing fraternity feel like he deserves it. So I do have to go with George Kambosos on a close UD, 1 or 2 points, or a split decision. However, hopefully we do get some honest judging. It's unlikely, but hopefully. But also hopefully it's a good fight, because that's what us boxing fans love to see. This has, of course, just been my opinion. If you agree or disagree, let me know in the comment section below and I'll get back to you. What do you think is going to happen in this fight? Leave it all down below and I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening as always, and I'll catch you in the next video.